Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Jungle. I'm your host, Hamilton Winters, strategist with Liger Partners. Thanks to all of our viewers joining in on Facebook Live. Really excited this morning to be joined by our good friend, Tom Greene, viral blogger and podcaster. Tom, how you doing this morning?
I'm good, Hamilton. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on The Jungle.
Absolutely. I'm excited about what you have to say today, just from our prior conversations and some of the things that I've been reading. Why don't we do this? Why don't we start by you just introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about your blogs and podcast content from tomgreene.com.
Yeah, happy to do it. And first of all, thanks for having me on. I know you guys have a ton of people lined up wanting to be on your show, and so I appreciate you working me in.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned, I have a podcast and a blog at www.tomgreene.com, and I write about kindness, friendship, growth, and well-being. Those are kind of my four go-to topics. It originally started as a men's blog, sort of expanded now to be men and women focused. Topics kind of all over the board. And what I try to do is I just try to find interesting stories that I find in my travels that I think point out inspiration, emotion, and just general sort of aha moments for people as they're reading my stories.
That's awesome. There's a saying, right, that you're either a speaker who writes or a writer who speaks. What would you consider yourself to be?
Wow, that's...
It's a difficult one.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I really like to write. I've been writing my whole life. I actually, the other day, I came across a story that I had written when I was in kindergarten.
That's cool.
And I think the extent of the story was the old dog jumped over the brown log, period. That was the end of the story. And it was a good reminder that I actually started writing, I think, before I could probably write.
Wow.
And so I would have to say, based on that, I'm actually a writer. On the other hand, I love to talk about what I write about.
Gotcha.
To me, a lot of times, getting in settings like this allows us to get deeper into the story than we might if we're just writing. Mm-hmm. Writing has certain limitations to it. So I'm a writer first, I'm a speaker second, but these are topics that I just find passionate, and thankfully there are a lot of folks out there who seem to find my writing inspirational, so I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got connected through our mutual friend Tucker Yates. So I don't know if Tucker's watching, but thank you, Tucker, for connecting us. This website that you have and all your blog stories, I've read a handful of them, and the style that you use is really, it does a great job of conveying the message. And what I really like is that you throw in other people's quotes. You also throw in some GIFs, some moving images, in between your writing to kind of draw in that visual side of what would normally be just the words, or maybe reading it out loud to yourself. Have you found that that's an effective way to put these blogs up on your website?
Yeah, it is. I think of my writing as a conversation with the reader. So
That's
you'll
good.
notice in my writing a lot of times I'll ask questions and then I'll answer my own questions. And it's sort of a way to create that dialogue back and forth with someone who's not really sitting there.
Yep.
And that's what I want. I want my stories to be thought-provoking. I want my podcast to be thought-provoking. I want to make people think about things in a different way. In fact, the other day I was writing the story called The Friendless American Male. That's my next post. And this idea popped in my head that, men are basically emotional mullets. So you know what a mullet is?
Of course.
Yeah. So
Business in the front,
party
in
in
the
the
back.
rear, right. And if you think about the average male, they are just that. It's sort of on the surface, everybody's great, everybody's living the dream. We all want to be great in other people's eyes. Mm-hmm. But then sort of behind that, as you spin the average male around, you find out there's a whole lot more going on in the back than what you thought. And it's what I speak about when I talk about certain men leading lives of quiet desperation. And I'm not saying that's every man out there, but through our friend Tucker Yates and other friends who are pastors who are out there working and counseling with men, I think you find out there's a lot more going on in our community than most people would imagine.
Than you would imagine from the facade that you see, especially in communities like ours. I mean, I live in Buckhead. You've lived in the metro Atlanta area for quite some time. Not that it's unique here, but it's very apparent.
It is, but as men, we don't talk about things
Mm-hmm.
maybe the way that women do. And somewhere along the way in our evolution out of the cave, we decided that sharing things that are difficult or challenging or emotional in some way has something to do with your sexuality or your manhood.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, it's time we let that one go.
Yeah, that's good. Was there a moment that this hit you the hardest, that you said, I have to start doing something about this?
Yeah.
And can you expand upon that?
Yeah, there was. And without naming names, over the past several years in my community and yours as well, we've had a number of very high-profile suicides. And I say often, I don't want to be the suicide guy. My podcast and my writing is not suicide-oriented. But I think you have to look at those suicides as sort of the edge of the epidemic. And so that's what got me really thinking, is seeing these friends, acquaintances who are wildly successful, who have these amazing lives, who appear to have it all going on the surface. And then you find out that they've committed suicide. And I think the average guy walking down the street just says, that doesn't make sense to me. Yet we're busy. So we hear the story, we go to the funeral, it becomes a topic of conversation for 4 or 5 days afterwards. And then if it's not your best friend, you go back to your life. You go back to your job. You go back to your family. You go back to the things you were doing before that story happened. And that bothered me. I just felt like those situations, we need to ask more questions about that. What happened? Why? What was going on with this person? And I think that started a really interesting dialogue with my readers.
Wow, that's incredible. These, let me go back. Early part of last decade, in my community back in Louisiana, we had a rash of suicides, and it seems like suicide being a mental health issue, there's only so much you can do proactively. Everything seems to be reactive.
Yeah.
These stories, and reading one in particular about a gentleman that you wrote about, Kyle, was extremely moving. And I believe that was the one that picked up a lot of traction. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, there were two stories. There's one about Kyle, and then there's one about Nick Marshall. Wow. And Nick Marshall was a young man, 19 years old, who went to high school in Atlanta, who was a great athlete, just an amazing kid. And I've said openly, if I had a son, I'd want him to be like Nick Marshall.
Wow.
Just the all-American kid. Baseball, football, basketball, great grades, gets into the University of Virginia, gets on the rowing team, and somewhere along the way in his freshman year, out of nowhere, climbs the Culberth Road parking deck and ends his life. And you have to just stop and question, why is this happening? And there's this really disturbing trend that's going on, and I find this in my research. I find it more in the millennial range, but it's this epidemic called spontaneous suicide. And so you have these kids who are leading these quiet lives of desperation. No one really knows what's going on. And out of nowhere, they commit suicide. And to me, I mean, as a human, you just can't watch that happen without saying, hold on a minute. What is going on here? And what can we do about it? And so when I write about the subject and speak on the subject, I mean, one of the things I talk about, I hate to say it, but there are few things that men are better at doing than women. And one of them is we're a lot better at killing ourselves than women. So if you look at the statistics, for every one female suicide, there's 3.54 male suicides.
That's significant.
And I don't mean attempts, I mean actual successful.
Wow.
And that has to make you stop and think, what is different about men and women, and what's driving these statistics?
Wow. Have you ever heard of Pete Maravich? I'm sure you have. The basketball player? Pistol Pete.
Yeah, I watched him play one time in the Omni.
And I didn't live during his era. However, hearing about him as a basketball player was incredible.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard his testimony?
No.
His testimony is absolutely spectacular. And he talks about how he's had it all. He was the highest paid NBA player coming out of the draft. And when he had it all, he really had nothing. And the premise is money will buy you everything but happiness, and it'll pay your fare to every place but heaven. He said it's lonely at the top because when you get there, there's nobody to share it with.
Wow.
And it's cold, and there's nowhere else to go but down once
Yep.
you hit the top of the mountain. Do you feel like that's kind of the situation that we're running into, where you reach the top of the mountain, but it's still not enough?
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a desire in men to achieve and perform.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've read my blog or listened to my podcast, one of the things you'll find is a lot of times will revert back to the caveman.
Yep.
and if you think about it, when we were cavemen, since we all go back to genetically where we came from. I mean, we lived in a cave and we wore a loincloth, and we went out and killed stuff to eat and build fires, and if we weren't successful, we died.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a lot of ways, men of our generation are still working like they're cavemen. They're still working as if what they do every day is somehow tied to their survival.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. And look, I'm as guilty of this as anybody, but we work harder than any other generation. And we work harder not just at our careers, but we work harder at being good parents and good
Mm-hmm.
husbands, and and try to be good friends. And somewhere along the way, pieces of that have to fall away. I mean, you can't be good at everything.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of it. There's this desire to work hard. There's this desire to be everything to everybody. And at some point along the way, men sort of hit the wall and say, "Is this it?
Yeah.
Is this everything?" And that, I think, is the crux of, I thought all this was going to make me happy, and I'm not sure I'm as happy as I thought I would be when I was in college and looking at how hard I was going to have to work in order to get the trappings of success.
Of course. That makes a lot of sense. When do you find time to do your writings? I know it's a passion of yours, but it's not your day job.
It's not my day job, and it's challenging. And I find, honestly, I don't sleep much, so a lot of my writing is done at 4:00 in the morning. I'll wake up and be inspired by something. Late night inspiration. And it's funny because my wife will ask me, did you have a dream, or did you wake up thinking about that? I don't know. I just woke up and Emotional Mullet popped in my head and I wrote it down.
Here we go.
Here we go. And that's honestly the way a lot of my stories have started is, an idea pops in my head and I'll write it down on paper, and then I like to say that sort of the spirit moves me, and next thing you know, I've got 2,000 words on a piece of paper, and I don't know where any of it came from.
Yep. I've had similar experiences, and instead of sitting here and trying to answer for it, it's there for a purpose, and if you feel the need to share it, then I have no doubt that that's why you wrote it down. You've gone the step further than I have, because I have a lot of writings that I haven't published yet. What was that difference between sitting here on good content and moving forward and making something happen with it?
Well, like I said, I've been writing since back when I was in kindergarten at Warren T. Jackson.
Yeah.
Now there's a little gap in time there, but I'll say I've been writing my whole life, and I did spend a number of years writing sort of in anonymity for various internet magazines and publications. And what was interesting about that is it allowed me to practice my craft, to be creative, and to release it to the world.
Yep.
Without any fear of repercussion of people I know saying, "Hey, who are you? What do you know about this subject?" And so I did that for about 10 years, and then finally got to a point where I thought, well, I'm creating a message, I'm talking to people, but I'm not talking to the people I know and love.
Mm-hmm. That's huge.
It was a sort of an aha moment of, who am I talking to? I'm talking to complete strangers, and I'm getting wonderful feedback from that. And it is definitely feeding my creative spirit. But on the other hand, am I reaching the people I originally intended to reach? Yep. And the answer was no. So that's when I sort of pulled back and said, wait a minute, rather than for writing for strangers, I'm going to try writing one story for people that I know and just see what happens.
Yep.
So I released that first story, and I got 5,000 readers on my website on the very first story. And
that's awesome.
And that was the spark that said,
of course,
okay, wait a minute. That's a pretty big following for one story for an unknown guy.
Let's try it again.
Yeah.
How did you come up with those 4 words: kindness, friendship, growth, and well-being?
the kindness word comes out of our family motto, which is nothing beats nice. We sat down and talked about all the options. You know, you can be smart, you can be rich, you know, you can be pretty, you can be good looking. But in my travels, what I've found is, of all of those adjectives, nothing beats nice. Nothing. I mean, you can be really rich and be a jerk. I know a ton of them. But nice just sort of transcends all ages, all genders, and it's, to me, if at the end of the day, if somebody can say about you, you are a really nice person, everything else kind of falls away. And so to me, nothing beats nice, sort of feeds right into kindness. And I like to write stories, frankly, and we like to read stories about kind people. You know, it's just a fact. We really like to hear about people doing good things. And so that to me ties right into friendship. Part of being a friend is being kind. And with men, I think we really struggle with, as we get older, how do we maintain those friendships? It's very challenging. And all the studies show that as men get older, they get lonelier. And in my research, what I'm finding is that epidemic is moving back younger and younger. And so you'll find statistics out there like 20% of all millennials claim that they have no friends at all. No friends at all. The most connected generation in history has no friends at all. 1 out of 5. 22% say that they are often or always lonely. Those are pretty disturbing statistics for a group of men who should be at the prime of their life and their friendships and in their ability to have time to contribute to those friendships, and yet they're finding themselves lonely at 22 years old.
Wow. I'm part of that. I wouldn't say that I would ever answer a survey saying that, but I can understand it. And a lot of what we go through in this generation, I would say we were almost a social experiment.
Yes.
You put a computer in front of us at a young age, and then you put cell phones in our hands. What I'm seeing is there's even a very notable difference between this next generation. I'm on the tail end of millennial.
Right.
This Gen Z, who knows?
So I like to refer to them as the TikTok generation.
That makes sense. Ingrid, we have Aaron, who was on the podcast with us, and I call him the Gen Z translator.
That's great.
Because he starts talking about TikTok and streaming services, and I'm like, can you put this in a language that I can understand? I'm only 2 years older than him.
Yeah, it's moving quickly.
2 years can make the biggest difference. It's amazing.
Right, and I think the challenge with all of this technology is, you know, I'm probably the tip of the spear on this, because I'd suggest that my generation was sort of the first generation to have modern male friendships where we had access to all this technology. And one of the things I've learned, and unfortunately I've had to learn it the hard way, is, you know, you can't manage friendships over Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and text messaging. I mean, you can try and you can convince yourself that, hey, I'm staying in contact with my friends and I know what's going on in their lives, but, you know, really important conversations don't happen on Facebook. They happen face to face over a cold beer or two.
You're right.
And that's what I fear about this next generation coming along is they, you know, with many of these folks, their entire friendship group is virtual. So I had a conversation the other day with my daughter. She has 3,000 followers on Instagram. And the question I raised to her was, of those 3,000 followers, if you were to get hit by a bus tomorrow and your funeral was in 3 days, how many of those Instagram followers do you think would fly across the country to attend your funeral? And she said, I think a great deal of them would. And we got into a dialogue back and forth to where ultimately she agreed, you know, they probably wouldn't come to my funeral, fly all the way across the country to meet a total stranger to attend their funeral. And those are the kind of aha moments of, are these people my friends or are these people just interesting digital acquaintances?
That makes sense. You could be well connected and still be lacking community.
That is absolutely accurate. I have 16,000 followers on Twitter, and I'm convinced about half of them are Chinese bots in a basement somewhere in Beijing.
They make you feel good, though.
They make me feel great, you know? But I don't think they're real people.
That makes sense. I think that's why what Tucker and other people have done that have impacted my life is to create those groups where you can find that good community. As much as we like to complain and talk about how lacking these generations are, if you flip that on its head, you can also make the argument that people are hungry for community more than ever because that is what they lack.
So that's a great segue. One of my good friends is a guy named Scott Chappell that lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Scott's been heavily involved in a group called F3.
Okay.
And I'm going to probably stumble here. Faith, fitness, and fellowship, I think, are the three F's.
Okay.
And they essentially created a group that meets at 5:30 in the morning that works out together. That's all they do.
Yeah.
5:30 to 6:30, we work out, and then we, some guys will go get coffee. Most of them go to work. And that movement started in Charlotte and moved to Atlanta, is now spread all across the country. And it is essentially just an opportunity for men to get together and be with one another. And I think that's what we're lacking. I think we're all so busy, we're moving so fast that of all those things I mentioned earlier, if you think about your job and your family and your children, your friendships are the ones that fall to the wayside, because in that category of hierarchy, they're at the lower end of the hierarchy, unfortunately. And I put that together with Tucker Yates, who's formed Purpose on Tap here in Atlanta, where he gathers 200 to 300 millennial-ish age guys together once a month for a couple of beers and a speaker.
Yep.
And I just think it's fascinating to watch these movements, watch these men gather just purely in the spirit of being together, with no real intent in mind. And I truly believe it's a movement, and I also think it's something that potentially could be an antidote to this epidemic that we're seeing.
I agree. And I think it starts with getting rid of that taboo that you can't have beer and Jesus at the same time.
I will tell you, you can have beer and Jesus at the same time. I've had beer and Jesus with my pastor at the same time. So I can tell you, it can be done.
I love it. In some of the readings that I've read of yours, it seems to have a lot of tiebacks to the war, World War II.
Yeah.
In this generation, which we haven't seen a major war, arguably, since Vietnam.
Yeah.
Do you see some of that community falling away because of these wars in the past? It seemed like our grandfathers had that community because they were in the war together.
Yeah.
And they would come back and they had their American Legion and they had their coffee shop and the guys that served.
Yeah.
And you grow up with the kids in your neighborhood, but then you move off to Atlanta, and then what do you do with your Louisiana friends? It seemed like an interesting parallel there. I don't know if you want to extend upon that.
Well, you make a great point. We haven't had a major war. We haven't had a world war in our generation. But I would argue that in your generation, since the day you were born, we were at war.
Yep.
We've been at war your entire life.
That's a good point.
We've been at war for the entire life of most millennials that are out there today. And so I think we've almost become, it's kind of the inverse of that. We've almost come to a point where we are normalized. It has become normal.
Numb to it.
We've become numb to it.
Yeah.
That we're at war, and there are men out in the trenches, carrying M16s and throwing grenades and getting shot at.
Yep.
And here we are sitting here doing a podcast. And so I think we've become numb to the idea of war. The other thing I like to talk about, and I say this respectfully, but there's a great generational divide between the greatest generation and perhaps our generation. And one of them is that when I go in a locker room, men of the greatest generation could care less about putting a towel around themselves. They'll walk around naked as the day is long. And the men of our generation, are walking around with 4 towels wrapped around them.
Modesty.
And I find that, there's probably a story there somewhere. But I think it's interesting, and it probably speaks to the fact that that generation has seen and done a whole lot more than our generation can ever imagine. We owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. I don't know how we'll ever repay it.
Yeah.
But I do love the fact that we have started to recognize those veterans of wars like World War II and frankly like Vietnam and Korea as being incredible heroes right in our midst. And they're with us every day.
Yep. And we so easily look over them.
We walk right past them on the street.
Yep.
We do.
They're dying every day.
Yeah.
We lose them every single day.
It was funny. My wife and I were walking to church the other day, and we walked past a gentleman leaving our homeless breakfast at church, and he was carrying everything he owned on his back. And he was having the loveliest, funny conversation with himself and just laughing and talking, and he was all by himself.
Yeah.
And my wife looked at me and said, I wonder who he's talking to. And I said, he's talking to himself. And she said, well, interesting. And I said, yeah, the only difference between him and me is he's having his conversation on the outside.
That's a great point. That's hilarious. What's next for your blog and for the writings that you have? I mean, where ideally do you want to see this thing? I think I have a good idea, but I want you to say it.
Well,
proclaim it.
So I'll tell you this: I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. I've started a number of businesses. Some have done well, some haven't done well. But with every one of those businesses, I've sat down and written a business plan. I've made a long-range plan and said, here's how I'm going to get there. When I started TomGreene.com, I intentionally did not have a mission. I didn't have a business plan. I didn't say, here's my goals, here's what I'm trying to get to. I just said, you know what, I'm going to put some messages out there, and I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to see how the Spirit moves through this message.
Yeah.
And it's been one of the most rewarding exercises of my life because things are happening. I'm getting invitations to speak to very large audiences. My work's getting picked up and put in magazines, things I couldn't imagine, and things that I think speak to the power of the message, but also speak to the power of the Spirit sort of moving through me and taking this in the direction it's intended to go. And that's what I love about it is I don't know where it's headed.
Yep.
The podcast is a wonderful evolution. I never would have envisioned that from day one. The invitations to speak to audiences, I never would have intended that from day one.
Yeah.
So I'm having fun kind of being surprised by where it's going without, mapping out every step of the way. And I kind of like the way that's happening.
That's awesome. I mean, we've seen, whether it's through the Bible or from different stories over time, if it's Spirit-led, it will take. Yeah. It'll take like a wildfire.
Agreed.
And it seems like that's happening in your life. What is, and I like to do this right before we wrap up, what's the best piece of advice you can give the viewers? I'm putting you on the spot here. I didn't prep you for this.
Yeah.
But if we looked back and we said, Tom Greene on the podcast gave us this one piece of advice that really worked for him, that he had heard over his life, or that, you came up with, that you could give people that's really impactful, what would that be?
That's a tough question. I think I mentioned to you earlier, I've written 35 stories on my website, and there comes a point where you've written and said so much that it starts to become like a word stew, and it's difficult to pull out nuggets of wisdom. But, if you've read my stuff, I'll frequently say life is a journey, and it's not always on a straight road. Sometimes the road's curvy, and sometimes there are potholes along the way.
Yep.
And you need to learn to anticipate that. And to me, I think the one thing I would say to men in particular is to, with all the things you're doing and all the things you're attempting, don't forget your friendships. Recommit to your friendships. Because at the end of the day, when all else falls away, the only thing that's really going to matter is the strength and the power of those friendships, those lasting friendships over a long, long period of time.
That's fantastic. I think that speaks to everything that we've talked about here today. It speaks to all the groups that we've referenced. It speaks to that community that's lacking. And it speaks to the power of a conversation like this one that we had today. And I just want to personally thank you for coming on this show because I have every impression that you are and will be an absolute success in whatever you do, especially with the stuff that I've read so far. And what I'd ask is the viewers visit your website. How else can they get in touch with you or continue the conversation? Because I know that they will want to.
Yeah.
What's the best way?
Well, first of all, Hamilton, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's great to chat with you. And I would encourage your viewers and listeners to visit TomGreene.com, TomGreene with an E.com. The other guy's the comedian, who I don't think is very funny. You can also find me on Facebook at Tom Greene Blog, and you can find me on Twitter at Greene with an E on the end _Tom. And I'll pretty much respond to anybody that jumps on any of those mediums.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to everything that you put out from here on out with the Friendless American Male.
That's it.
Is that correct?
That's the next blog post.
We're anticipating that being a huge success and excited for us to be able to hear it here before it even comes out and excited for what you'll do with the podcast going forward. So thank you again for all the viewers on Facebook Live and just watching the podcast. We really appreciate you joining us on The Jungle today with our good friend Tom Greene. Everybody have a great day. Hope it's a fantastic one, and nothing beats nice. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.